What exactly does an outstanding comparative essay for A-level English literature look like? What are those assessment objectives all about, and particularly those slightly weird, very specific percentage allocations for each assessment objective? What traps can the most talented of English literature students fall into, thus reducing their chances of getting that top grade? Well, in this video, I'm going to explain all of that and pick apart an outstanding essay that I wrote. So, stay tuned, you're watching Schofield on Shakespeare.
We're gonna build a palace, and we'll be so proud. A palace where the roar of the crowd will tell the world our palace will last forever.
This video isn't very long, so I'd recommend going through it in sequential order. However, if you so choose, you can jump to the section of your choice by referencing the hyperlinks below within the YouTube description box. Let's kick off with the fiddly mark scheme for this question, focusing on the top band. There are 4 assessment objectives. Let's go through them in order of importance. So this is probably the biggest challenge when it comes to writing this essay, and that is integrating sufficient contextual points within your introduction and main arguments. In theory, this should take up 50% of your entire essay. In practice, looking over past exemplar candidate work provided by OCR, this doesn't seem to take up half the essay, or indeed anything like that much. Nonetheless, it is clear that a significant proportion of your essay needs to be exploring and discussing the effect of the different contexts. What exactly does that mean? Well, an OCR A-level delivery guide to the Women in Literature theme draws attention to the unprecedented changes in the social, political and legal position of women over the past 200 years. In Austen's time, women were subject to rigid social conventions and legal constraints that predetermined their existence. Sense and Sensibility was first published in 1811. Women would not be given the vote for a further 111 years. In 1975, 10 years before the publication of Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, the Sex Discrimination Act was passed, meaning that in theory women could not be denied a job on the basis of their sex. So any question comparing female characters and the lives of women across such different periods needs to take into account such different contexts. Why might women be behaving in a certain way within one text but not the other? To what extent can that be attributed to their particular contexts? In addition, how are we as readers likely to react differently to texts based on our own contexts? To give some practical examples from Sense and Sensibility and Oranges, might we feel more sympathy than Austen's original readers towards both Marianne and Willoughby due to modern propensities to value personal fulfillment and passion extremely highly following the relatively recent introduction of social media? In relation to Oranges, might we be more baffled than readers in the 1980s at Jeanette's treatment after her homosexual tendencies have been uncovered due to the increasing campaigning and understanding of LGBTQ+ issues? So 50% on context and 25% on comparisons. The key point here is that you shouldn't just alternate between your texts within separate paragraphs, i.e. do one paragraph on Sense and Sensibility, followed by one on Oranges, followed by one on Sense and Sensibility, etc. You want to be comparing as much as possible intra-paragraphs, using phrases such as both, unlike, whereas, similarly, in contrast. 50% on context, 25% on comparisons, and 12.5% on how well you write, how well you answer the question, and how well you understand your texts. In practice, some of this surely weaves into AO3 context. For you cannot weave in intelligent points about how the lives of women have changed or different societal expectations if you do not relate this sharply to what is happening within the two texts. 50% context, 25% comparisons, 12.5% on argument and understanding of the two texts, and the final 12.5% for your use of critical quotations, or potentially radio or TV versions of the text. So, if you're studying Sense and Sensibility, you might include a reference to the 1995 film version of Austen's novel, in which Emma Thompson is far too old as Eleanor, and Hugh Grant brings his faux bumbling charm, inverted commas, to the role of Edward Ferrars. If studying Oranges, you can include a reference to the 1990 BBC version of the novel, which has the advantage over the Austen production in that Winterson herself wrote the screenplay. Crucially, unlike for the critical appreciation of an unseen passage, AO2 is not assessed. Whilst use of embedded quotations is recommended to help you show that you have a sophisticated, detailed understanding of the text, you should not be picking apart language or focusing on small details. In this comparative essay, you want to show that you have an excellent overview of what the writers are trying to say and achieve in both texts. Let's now move on to an actual exam question, taken from the June 2017 paper. Assuming that you have studied 2 of the set texts, you will be able to choose from 2 of the 3 questions from the Women in Literature section. The full comparative and contextual study exam lasts for 2 hours and 30 minutes, with a total of 60 marks available. You should therefore aim to spend 1 hour and 15 minutes on this question. I would recommend using 15 minutes to plan. Possibly sketching out a grid which looks something like this. I do take the point that time is very limited in the exam, and there isn't a huge amount of time to draw enormous tables. Nonetheless, I do think it's worth having something like this in mind, if only to use within practice questions. This grid is aimed to make sure that you do actually compare the 2 texts, and that you don't forget to incorporate contextual and critical perspectives. I will shortly show you my response and explain how it meets the various assessment objectives. However, before you see this, I would recommend you either planning your own essay on the title shown on screen, or actually writing it in full if you haven't done so already. This will give you something of your own to compare with my response, so you can begin to evaluate what you're doing well and where you need to improve. Either way, the choice is yours. Press pause now if you'd like to start writing a detailed plan or your response. The video will resume in 5 seconds time. Here's my response in full. In order for you to think about meeting the 4 different assessment objectives, I've color-coded each sentence and each phrase to indicate roughly which assessment objective is being met, although of course there is some overlap at times. This doesn't matter. The aim is simply to get you thinking about whether you have the balance right in your own essays. Indeed, if you have written an essay, it might be worth getting out a highlighter pen now to do something similar. In both Sense and Sensibility and Oranges Are Not the Only Fruits, there are strong female characters who support each other. Eleanor and Marianne clearly love each other dearly and want to do the best for each other, whilst only child Jeanette benefits from the support of mother figure Elsie Norris, and later on, her 2 lesbian lovers, Melanie and Katie. However, it is important to specify the different contexts of the novels. Whereas Austen is writing during the Regency period and seeks to gently satirize the Romantic movement, Winterson is writing in the late 20th century, a time of growing empowerment for women. Nonetheless, in spite of the comparative enlightenment of the 1980s, Winterson's text is a feminist one, which seeks to spotlight prejudice against women, particularly lesbian ones. This agenda is far more important than presenting cosy, carefree, supportive relationships between female characters, which could be argued is the case with Jane Austen's novels, who seem to enjoy giving her heroines conventionally happy endings. The two lead female protagonists in Austen's novel want, in principle, to support each other as much as possible. Marianne would not wound the feelings of her sister on any account, whilst Eleanor's excellent heart and acute judgment ensure that she's always thinking of the effect of her words and actions on her mother and sisters. However, although Marianne may want to be supportive, in practice, for the majority of the novel, she unwittingly adds to Eleanor's distress, as well as failing to make any effort to support Eleanor when it comes to behaving appropriately towards the Middletons and Mrs. Jennings, instead preferring self-indulgent silent musings and piano playing. She affirms at regular intervals that Edward still loves Eleanor, which leads her to conclude erroneously that she can have no grief. Whilst Marianne may not know about Lucy and Edward's secret engagement, her inability to see beyond her own self-indulgent, overly romanticised perspective on the world makes it virtually impossible for her to read her sister and gain an insight into her true state of mind and relationship with Edward. Or, put differently, Marianne's sensibility blinds her to the sense which is hiding the sensibility of her sister, making it impossible to reciprocate the support she is given. In contrast, Jeanette in Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit is an only child, and an adopted one at that, which means that she has no access to potential support from the same generation within her family unit, adequate or inadequate. That said, in the early stages of the novel, Jeanette's mother does offer something approaching conditional support to her daughter. For instance, she refuses to rebuke her after receiving a letter from school asking for moderation of her religious leanings, and instead takes her to the cinema as a treat. She also spends plenty of time with her daughter, initially home educating her, and occasionally whipping her up some bacon and eggs in the middle of the night when Jeanette was unable to sleep and was feeling lonely. However, note the use of the adjective conditional in relation to her supports. Mrs. Winterson is only prepared to support her daughter if she behaves exactly in accordance with her Pentecostal church's narrow rules. As soon as she discovers her natural lesbian inclinations, she becomes no daughter of mine and an object of repulsion for aping men. To some extent, Mrs. Dashwood in Sense and Sensibility also fails to support her daughters in the way that they need, as well as failing to understand the importance of renting a house they can actually afford. She gives Marianne free rein in her relationship with Willoughby, contributing to the former committing numerous foolish acts of impropriety, and in all likelihood increasing the middle daughter's longer-term heartache. This stems from the fact Mrs. Dashwood shares Marianne's emotional idealism. However, by supporting her quest for true passionate love without insisting on any boundaries, she is failing to support her as a theoretically wiser, more experienced parent. Nonetheless, a closer exploration of the context gives insight into both Mrs. Dashwood and Mrs. Winterson's failures to provide adequate support to their daughters. In Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, there is no question that Mrs. Winterson believes wholeheartedly in her Pentecostal religion. When she tells Jeanette to leave home after uncovering her lesbian relationship, there is no hyperbole when she says, "I'm not having demons here." Her belief in God and the idea that homosexuality or unnatural passions is a heinous sin is absolute. Indeed, according to an LGBT campaigner speaking in a recent BBC Witness History episode, her negative attitude towards homosexuality was far from unusual. In the 1980s, about 75% of people when surveyed said that it was mostly or always wrong to be gay. Thus, the combination of entrenched religious beliefs and implicit societal prejudice mean that Mrs. Winterson feels it is impossible to support her daughter following the discovery of her homosexuality. In a similar way, given the lack of educational opportunities for women and primary focus on accomplishments such as music, singing, drawing, dancing, and the modern languages, to quote that expert Caroline Bingley from Pride and Prejudice, Is it unexpected that Mrs. Dashwood does not have the mathematical nous to fully comprehend just how disastrous it would be to take on a house she cannot afford? In some ways, you could argue that the two mothers are victims of their own ignorance, making genuine support for their daughters more difficult. However, Mrs. Dashwood does at least possess some emotional capabilities that are singularly absent in emotionally constipated Mrs. Winterson. Whereas the latter is horrified when her young daughter starts to cry in hospital, the former is overly guided by her emotions, which can of course result in loving supportive parenting, notably when Marianne is convalescing in Cleveland. Critics of Austen have regularly drawn attention to the importance of marriage and the fact it represents the opportunity to ascend the social hierarchy and obtain material security. This, to a significant extent, explains a character such as Lucy Steele in Sense and Sensibility, who appears to be something approaching Eleanor's nemesis rather than a supporter for much of the novel. Once she has confided in Eleanor about her engagement to Edward, under the guise of being very glad of your advice, she seems to take every possible opportunity to unleash barbed jibes in the direction of her competitor, though you do not know him so well as me, Miss Dashwood. But this is the point. They are competitors, vying for success in a congested marketplace. In the early 19th century, the options were pathetically limited for women. They could take on governessing slavery, in the words of that notable feminist Rochester from Jane Eyre, whose triumphant final marriage Mrs. Winterson so naughtily erased. Or they could marry someone who could offer them, at the least, financial and social security. Yes, some of these women would have dowries, which would make them more attractive in the marriage market, but Eleanor, Lucy, and indeed Marianne have either nothing or next to nothing financially to offer a potential husband. The wonder should be that Marianne and Eleanor manage to disinterestedly support each other as much as they do, rather than that Lucy acts so malevolently towards Eleanor. Overall, Jeanette only has sporadic female support in Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, and no male support whatsoever. She is ejected from the church community which she viewed as our family, and somewhere she felt safe. Both lesbian relationships come to a shuddering halt, leaving her a wistful, fiercely yearning, isolated figure at the end of the novel. Whereas she lacks and misses the company of someone utterly loyal, Marianne and Eleanor have each other, and the former has become wiser through experience and thus better placed to support the elder sister on a more equal footing. Indeed, Rachel Browning goes so far as saying that the concluding paragraph to the novel startlingly gives Eleanor and Marianne's attachment to one another pride of place, so as to make their second attachment to their husbands seem merely secondary. This, if true, would be a startlingly feminist ending, one which certainly Winterson would approve of. However, the fact that Eleanor and Edward have loved each other for the majority of the novel might suggest that for one sister at least, her long-awaited heterosexual marriage will bring her the fulfillment and financial security she has craved. The colour coding was worth doing, wasn't it? And even now I'm wondering whether I've got the balance right. Certainly when I started highlighting, I wondered whether I should have included more comparisons earlier on. And this is another way of approaching the question. However, my thinking was that I wanted to establish an excellent, detailed understanding of the text early on, aided by short, embedded quotations and pertinent references. Remember also that AO1 requires you to consistently develop your argument, which isn't easy if you're always thinking about making glib comparisons. Within the extract on screen, I refuse to oversimplify and move from saying initially that Marianne wants to be supportive, is keen and well-meaning, before changing direction and pointing out that actually, for the majority of the novel, she unwittingly adds to Eleanor's distress, i.e. she isn't that supportive at all. Having established a detailed perceptive understanding of sense and sensibility, I then want to show the examiner that I also have a nuanced, detailed understanding of oranges as well. However, every time I move from one text to the other, I want to include a comparative statement, which I do here by pointing out that Jeanette's only child status is likely to make it harder for her to get decent female support in comparison to someone like Eleanor, who has 2 sisters. For my AO1, I'm looking to avoid an oversimplified argument. It would be all too easy to say that Mrs. Winterson is a terrible mother and doesn't support Jeanette at all, but that isn't quite right, and so I give very specific evidence from the text using plenty of short embedded quotations and argue that in some ways Mrs. Winterson is supportive. In terms of quotations, a number of my pupils have fretted about having to memorize quotations for the exam. However, I would point out 2 things. Firstly, the quotations don't necessarily need to be particularly long or complex, as you would not be analysing them for language. And secondly, over time, you will naturally remember quotations, particularly as Winterson in particular has some memorable phrases which you will recall without trying, e.g. unnatural passions, breeding grounds, AP men, etc. Having established and shown the examiner that I know my texts, it's time to start making up ground by probing the different contexts to the novel, which will help me develop and clarify my argument further. Yes, Mrs. Winterson is unable to support Jeanette following the revelations about her homosexuality, but the context of the novel itself implicitly explains why. It runs counter to her fixed, devout Christian beliefs, which are central to her mode of existence. I also reference the context of the time and point out that in the 1980s, a great deal of hostility towards gay people still existed, shedding further insight into why Mrs. Winterson behaves as she does. Perhaps this paragraph has a near-perfect balance in terms of meeting the assessment objectives. Yes, AO5, different interpretations, is not addressed, but as my essay has shown, it is unrealistic and unnecessarily formulaic and robotic to try to meet every single assessment objective within every single paragraph. This paragraph contains some useful context on expectations for women during Austen's time, actually taken from a different Austen novel, which is helpful in terms of furthering the impression that I am interested in women in literature more broadly, not just within my 2 texts. It's perhaps worth emphasizing that the question asks you to compare at least 2 texts, with the implicit assumption here surely being that the best candidates will reference briefly more than 2. I reference 2 more texts outside Sense and Sensibility and Oranges. I have my reference to stuck-up Caroline Bingley from Pride and Prejudice, and a quotation from that brutish heartthrob Rochester in Bronte's Jane Eyre. These quotations give invaluable contextual insights, but also suggest to the examiner that I am genuinely interested in the area of women in literature. Notice also that the best essays don't have to be and shouldn't be dull. Any examiner is likely to pick up on the ironic description of Rochester as a notable feminist and chuckle. As the essay draws closer to the end, I begin to weave in some critical interpretations. Notice that you don't always need to name your critic, especially when he or she is saying something as fundamental as women during Austen's time needing to marry to obtain material security. Personally, I like the idea of quibbling or arguing against a critical quotation. This clearly shows the examiner that you are wrestling with more complex ideas, rather than putting things in just for the sake of it. With the paragraph on screen, a note that this time I have given the critic's name, I argue against the rather silly idea that one single paragraph towards the end of the novel suggests that a female relationship will somehow be more significant than 2 new marriages and all that these entail. I've also managed to include a skillful, seamless comparison between Jeanette's wild, isolated loneliness and Eleanor and Marianne, whose relationship is now stronger than ever. Although examiners will mark using the assessment objective grids that I have so tediously referred to, there will also be some guidance about the kind of ideas candidates may use. When the question allows candidates to choose either Sense and Sensibility or Mrs. Dalloway, plus one of 8 other additional texts, only the most naive, new to the industry marker would expect a huge amount of detail here. I didn't read this before writing my response for obvious reasons, but note that I covered the stronger support system of Eleanor and Marianne, and also referenced the mother and Lucy Steele in Austen's novel. What I didn't do, but could have done perhaps, was talk about the plenty of male characters who might be seen as strongly supportive. Colonel Brandon comes to mind, but also that jovial fool Sir John Middleton. This guidance, however, doesn't refer to oranges are not the only fruits. But press pause now if you would like to read this through in full more carefully. So what are the key points to remember when answering this question? I would suggest the following. Use 15 minutes to plan so your argument is developed and interesting. Avoid oversimplified comments, or make these at the beginning of the paragraph before moving in a different direction and tweaking and re-clarifying. Thirdly, embed quotations, which can be pretty short, but they can help ensure that your points are not overly general or waffly. Your critical quotations do need to fit seamlessly into your arguments. Ideally, agree with one part of it, but challenge another. And finally, and most importantly, the context. This must not be tagged on hopefully at the end of paragraphs, but integrated within the main arguments. Perhaps it doesn't need to take up the full 50%, but trust me, there's so much to talk about when it comes to the lives of women over the past 200 years. Why would you not want to talk about this in full in relation to our 2 glorious texts?
This has been a Schofield on Shakespeare A-level guide, showing you exactly what's needed for that comparative essay. Many thanks for watching.